700 years ago, an army vanished not in defeat, but into the shadows. The world was told they were destroyed. But what if that was the greatest lie in history? What if they were never gone at all, only hidden in plain sight beneath the cold floors of Europe's oldest churches? Messages carved in secret still wait for someone who knows how to read them. They are not prayers, they are not decoration, they are warnings, and perhaps a map. The only question is, when you see the signs, will you understand what they're telling you? Beneath the cold floors of medieval churches, the stones whisper, not in a way you can easily hear, but in a language older than speech, carved into corners most eyes never notice, hidden in shadows that shift with the passing of centuries. They speak in the faint curve of a chisel mark worn smooth by generations, of fingertips, in the precision of shapes, too exact to be chance, in the moment when a single shaft of sunlight pierces the gloom, falling on a place that is nothing until you look twice. Most people would walk by without a second thought. You wouldn't blame them. The message isn't meant for them. But for the few who know where to look, these are signposts, warnings, invitations. The Templars, history tells us, vanished in fire and ashes, burned at the stake, scattered to the winds, their power broken, their name dragged through the mud of official decrees. That is the story we are taught, the clean ending. But history loves a clean ending, and clean endings are rarely the truth. What if they never truly left? What if their last message, crafted for eyes centuries in the future, still lingers here, hidden in plain sight, waiting under our feet? What if, after 700 years, it is still watching, still warning, still calling for someone to answer? You step inside the church. The air is cool, and the sound changes instantly, your voice muffled, your footsteps softened by the embrace of old stone. The walls seem to hold their breath, and the stillness feels almost like a presence. There's a weight here, not the kind that rests on your shoulders, but the kind that seeps into your bones. This story isn't just about the past, it's about what survived it. You stand at the threshold of a place raised when Europe was still reeling from the Crusades, when crowns changed hands in shadows as often as they did in open war. From the outside, it is unremarkable. A few buttresses stand like weary guards. The bell tower leans, tired but unbowed. The heavy door, its hinges groaning, opens with the slow sigh of something ancient. The first thing you notice inside is the smell: cold stone, melted candle wax, a faint tang of metal, like rainwater that has trickled through iron nails. Light seeps in through narrow windows, thin and fractured, casting beams where dust motes drift like constellations. You take in the familiar scene: rows of pews, an altar shrouded in white, paintings of saints whose eyes seem to follow you in that way old religious art always does. And yet, there's a pull, something at the edge of your vision, a whisper, that not everything here is what it pretends to be. Historians tell us the Knights Templar were dissolved in 1312, pressured by the French king. The Pope declared them gone, lands seized, leaders burned, their names struck from the records. But paper and proclamations are one thing. Reality is often another. Whispers persisted of brothers who traded swords for chisels, battlefields for building sites, men who stripped of their banners, learned to speak in the language of stone. If the legends are right, their messages are still here, hidden in the very buildings they worked on. Not words on parchment that could be burned, but patterns of shadow and light, carvings in places no one thinks to look, messages for those they trusted. Centuries later, you walk deeper into the church, brushing your fingers against the wall. The stone is cool, pitted with age. Some carvings are clear angels, curling vines, coats of arms. Others resist, easy, naming perfectly measured geometric patterns. A 5-petaled flower hidden near the base of a column. A cross, not of the Latin kind, but sharper, older. It is easy to dismiss them as decoration. Most people do. But once the idea of a code takes root in your mind, you can't unsee it. The church begins to change. Every carving becomes suspicious. Every angle a potential signal. Every beam of light an accomplice in a centuries-old conspiracy. It's like staring at a crossword puzzle. You know you can solve if only you can think the way its creator thought. And here is where the stories grow stranger. Researchers claim that in some churches the code still functions. That on certain days when the sun or moon aligns just so, symbols combine to form shapes, maps, or words that no one can see at any other time. If that's true, then these aren't just churches, they're vaults, not for gold or relics, but for knowledge, for warnings, perhaps even for something more tangible. You glance down at the flagstones beneath your feet. They look ordinary, worn, uneven, dulled by centuries of footsteps. But the Templars were known for hiding things where no one thought to look. Who suspects the ground they're standing on? Somewhere beneath these walls may lie a truth that refused to die. A language of stone, carved for those with the patience, courage, and yes, obsession to follow it. The question is no longer whether such a code exists. The question is whether you'll recognize it when it stares back at you. Picture Paris, October 13th, 1307. A cold dawn. The streets echo with boots and chains. Across France, in a single, perfectly coordinated sweep, the order of the Knights Templar is torn apart. The king's men move under cover of darkness, forcing their way into commanderies, dragging brothers from their beds. Hours earlier, these men were preparing for prayer. Now they are prisoners. Officially, this was the blow that ended them. But the truth is rarely so simple. Between the public arrests and the private reality, there is space enough for escape, for strategy, for survival. By the early 1300s, the Templars were more than just a band of warrior monks. They were a vast, sophisticated network whose influence stretched from England to the Holy Land. They owned ports, castles, farmland, vineyards, even entire towns. They served as bankers to kings, protectors of pilgrims, and, if their enemies are to be believed, keepers of dangerous secrets. A strike like this should have left chaos behind. And yet, some lands were never seized. Some treasure accounts were mysteriously emptied just before the arrests. Some men simply vanished. One fact is certain. In the months before the crackdown, Templar ships were seen leaving the French port of La Rochelle under the cover of darkness. No one knows what they carried. Chroniclers say they sailed west to Scotland or Portugal, where the orders to arrest them were ignored, delayed, or conveniently misplaced. Those who escaped found new lives. Some disappeared into obscurity. Some kept their names, protected by sympathetic rulers. And the most skilled among them found new work, not in war, but in stone. These were men who had overseen the construction of commanderies, fortresses, chapels across continents, across decades. They knew how to read a block of stone the way a scholar reads a manuscript. Architectural Guild records from the years after the Templar fall tell of a sudden arrival of master craftsmen in cathedral towns, not knights, but friars, Demeter, brothers of the craft. Later, Masonic writings describe their techniques and usual measurements, exact geometric ratios, and symbolic carvings whose meanings were for the initiated alone. Skeptics say this is romantic fantasy, that architecture had always been full of symbols and geometry long before the Templars existed. But others point to something harder to dismiss: churches from that era bearing an unusual concentration of strange motifs, 8-pointed crosses instead of the Latin kind, flowers arranged in perfect pentagonal symmetry, patterns that seem to echo Templar trade routes. You think back to that one sharply cut cross you traced with your fingers earlier. What if the same hand that carved it once gripped a sword on the walls of Jerusalem? The disguise is not in the carving itself, in its purpose. What looks like simple ornament may be a quiet declaration. We are not gone, we are only hidden. And so you begin to wonder when you step into a medieval church, are you entering a sanctuary of faith, or a secret archive disguised as one? With the Templars, the answer is always just beyond reach, pulling you deeper, drawing you further into the hunt. You move closer to the stonework now, no longer just a visitor, but a seeker, searching for the second language of the architecture. The more you look, the more the surface blurs into layers, each one speaking to a different kind of watcher. On the surface, the church stands as a familiar work of medieval devotion, saints carved in solemn relief, arches adorned with vines and leaves, Latin inscriptions whispering calls to piety. The air smells faintly of stone dust and candle wax, the way it does in places where centuries of prayers have seeped into the walls. It feels, at first glance, like countless other houses of worship from the age. The floor is uneven underfoot, worn smooth in the center aisle where generations have walked, yet pitted and chipped along the edges where fewer feet have passed. You hear the muted creak of old wood from the pews, and in the upper reaches of the nave, faint motes of dust drift through thin shafts of light. Everything here speaks of age and continuity. But beneath this respectable face lies something far more deliberate. If the Templars, or those who carried on their mission, wanted to leave a hidden message, it could never be obvious. By the time they were forced into secrecy, their enemies were still watching. Kings who owed them money were now confiscating their property. Inquisitors who once passed them in the street with a nod now questioned them under oath. Any sign of organized resistance would have been dangerous. And so the code, if it existed, had to be deniable. It had to blend perfectly with its surroundings, so that only the initiated door, the extremely observant, would ever notice. That meant carving it into the very bones of the building itself, so that removing it would require destroying the sacred walls it lived within. Stone was the perfect medium for such work. Altars could be stripped, manuscripts burned, relics stolen, but a symbol cut into a load-bearing column might survive for centuries. More ingenious still, some clues may have been designed to reveal themselves only in certain light, sun or moon aligning at precise angles on particular dates. A tiny window, placed high in the apse, might throw a beam across the floor to illuminate a single carving on the morning of the summer solstice. A slant of moonlight in winter might bring to life a pattern invisible the rest of the year. Without knowing the exact moment, the signs would remain invisible to everyone else. Evidence of intention appears in the repetition of certain motifs across great distances. For example, in both Portugal and southwestern France, churches stand that share the same rare geometric design, perfect 12-pointed star within a circle cut into the capitals of interior columns. These aren't casual approximations. The angles and proportions match with mathematical precision. While medieval artisans did reuse patterns, these examples match in placement and execution with uncanny exactness. The standard historical explanation is that traveling masons carried pattern books. But why would such a rare symbol, almost absent in ordinary church design, appear almost exclusively in regions tied to Templar refuge? One controversial theory is that these designs weren't decorative at all, they were ciphers. To someone with the key, the shapes could be read as letters, numbers, or even coordinates. The church itself became a page in a stone-bound book. Skeptics dismiss this as wishful thinking, a case of humans inventing meaning from coincidence. Yet the Templars were no strangers to ciphers. Surviving documents show they used substitution systems in writing. And there's nothing to say such systems couldn't be adapted to architecture. Here lies the problem of interpretation. Stone doesn't speak plainly, it offers only shapes. Without the key, you can't be sure whether you're decoding an ancient message or chasing your own imagination. And yet, the pull is undeniable. You can almost see them now, those fugitive brothers, their swords traded for chisels, their knowledge of compass and light turned toward carving messages in walls meant to outlast them. If they wished to pass along information, a location, an instruction, perhaps even a warning, this is how they would do it. Not in something fragile, but in something that might survive, not just beyond their lifetimes, but beyond the very faith that justified the building of the church. And this raises the question historians still debate. Were these codes meant for immediate use, guiding brothers to safety, or hidden resources in the years after the arrests? Or were they intended as time capsules, messages meant for a distant age when the knowledge would be needed again? Standing inside such a place, your eyes roam over the chancel arch, the carved bosses, the subtle irregularities of the floor tiles. Now, every one of them could be part of the code's anatomy. The question isn't whether something is hidden, but whether you have enough fragments to make the whole. The Templars knew the truth could be buried in plain sight, disguised as the ordinary, carried silently across centuries. You shift your weight, feeling the uneven rise of the flagstones beneath your feet, and wonder if the ground below you might hold the rest of the sentence you've only begun to read. You lean closer to a pillar, letting your eyes adjust to the dim interior. Patterns begin to emerge, not as pictures, but as script. Not the letters, you know, but a flowing vocabulary of curves, chisel strokes, and shadows, shaped by hands that worked with equal measures of precision and secrecy. The masons who carved them understood that the language of stone was slow and stubborn, but nearly eternal. Once spoken, it could outlast kingdoms. Once read, it could change the course of a search hundreds of years later. Historically, stonemasons marked their work with simple signatures, practical symbols used to claim credit or track payment. But here, among the ordinary marks, some are deliberately ambiguous, resisting easy interpretation. You trace the lines of a six-petaled flower and notice the petals are uneven, each one subtly aligned toward a different compass point. On its own, that might be an accident of the mason's hand. But when the same compass-aligned flower appears in multiple churches linked to the Templars, spread across hundreds of miles, coincidence feels less likely. We know that before their persecution, the Templars employed their own building crews. Their commanderies often doubled as fortified farms and pilgrim way stations, complete with chapels built by men loyal to the order. After the suppression, these men or their apprentices would have carried their skills and perhaps their loyalties into civilian work. Masons traveled constantly, moving from site to site, their tools and knowledge always with them. Some researchers believe that within this movement lay a hidden network, using stone not just for beauty, but for communication. The angle of a vine, the direction of a bird's beak, the spacing of repeated motifs, each could be a signal to those who knew the code. Skeptics counter that we're projecting intention onto decoration. But then there's the problem of certain recurring symbols, the octagonal star, the twin cross carving, appearing in ways that are hard to ignore. The geometric star, especially, stands out, mathematically perfect, almost jarring among the flowing natural forms around it. It hides in corners, placed where the casual observer would never look, yet precisely where a seeker might. If these were intentional, the placement says it all, visible, but only to those who know to search. The lingering question is whether this symbolic language was widely taught among sympathetic masons or kept to a tiny, trusted circle. Did every mason under a friendly lord know the signs, or was the code entrusted only to those who had once worn the white mantle and red cross? Some believe secrecy demanded it be limited to a few journeymen, each carrying fragments of the code to different regions. Others argue the sheer persistence of the patterns suggests a broader network, a distributed archive carved into the architecture of Europe. You walk the nave, glancing up at the capitals above the columns, angels, grapes, scrolls, and here and there, something that interrupts the rhythm. A face in stone, its expression unreadable. You pause. The mouth is slightly crooked. Like the others, the eyes seem fixed, not in prayer, but toward the far wall, toward a point where the afternoon sun might strike in late summer. If this were a code, this face might be telling you where to look next, and so you turn. The wall it faces is bare, except for a single recessed alcove containing a carved relief of a lamb. Above it, a small catafoil window lets in a blade of light, one that at this moment misses the lamb entirely. You can't help but wonder if, at a precise time of year, that light would fall exactly on the carving, marking the moment when another hidden element is revealed. The Templars, after all, were masters of timing. They understood the movements of the heavens, not only for navigation, but for symbolism. Aligning a church's architecture with a celestial event could turn the building into a kind of clock, one that chimed not with bells, but with light. And maybe, just maybe, those chimes spelled out something only their brothers would hear. A pair of crossed swords, so faintly incised into the weathered surface of the stone that they almost vanish into shadow. To an untrained visitor, they would be nothing more than meaningless oddities, scratches in the wall, perhaps the work of some idle mason centuries ago. But to someone attuned to the subtle language of these marks, they might be punctuation in a sentence that stretches silently from one end of the building to the other, is in a hurry to tell. Stone has no need to hurry. It simply waits. It waits as centuries turn to dust, as plaster crumbles, as beams shift in the slow grind of time. It waits while sunlight angles differently through each passing season. It waits while countless feet tread the floor, while generations come and go without once noticing the faint messages under their noses. And in that waiting, in that patience, you can almost feel the mindset of the men who might have placed these signs. Here men, but trusted that one day someone with sharp enough eyes and enough stubborn determination would follow the trail to its end. You pause by a window, its opening empty now, the glass long gone, the air from outside cool against your skin. Somewhere among these marks there might be a warning or an invitation, or perhaps both at once. The language of stone speaks slowly, but it never stops speaking, not even when the last of its authors has long since turned to dust. Later, you return to the same church, but at a different hour, and it is as though you have stepped into an entirely different building. The sun now hangs low in the western sky, and a narrow beam of gold pushes through a slender lancet window. Suddenly, the carvings you studied before shift in meaning, splitting it neatly in two. Above it, a column capital that had seemed entirely ordinary before now catches the light at a precise angle, revealing something you could have sworn wasn't there. The faint outline of a cross, its arms equal, etched so shallowly into the stone that only in this exact light could it be seen. Light, unlike stone, does not wait. It moves. It changes by the hour, by the season, by the century. And yet, the Templars seemed to know how to tame a Tor, at least anticipate its behavior. Long before the order was suppressed, they had already demonstrated a deep connection to astronomy, to the measurement of time, and to the rhythms of the heavens. The churches they commissioned in both the Holy Land and Europe often aligned themselves to significant celestial events, the equinoxes, the feast days of saints. Such alignments were not unheard of in medieval architecture, but in certain Templar sites, the precision is so exact, so deliberate, that it draws more than casual notice. In some of these buildings, the very first light of dawn on a particular day will pierce the darkness and strike a designated point in the sanctuary, illuminating a carving, a relief, or an inscription for only a few fleeting moments before slipping away. One fact stands out in particular: the Commandery Chapel in Tomar, Portugal. It could be accidental. On the feast day of the order's patron saint, for example, a single beam of sunlight lands exactly on a small relief of a Knights carving that remains in shadow for the rest of the year. Some see this as mere symbolic pageantry. Others believe it may have been an essential part of a larger, multi-step system for revealing messages at precisely the right time. And then there is the darker possibility, the one that deepens the mystery. In certain churches built after the fall of the order, similar light phenomena occur. But here's the odd part. These events don't happen on dates significant to the broader liturgical calendar. Instead, They align with moments tied to the Templars' own history. Take one small village church in France. There, each year, at mid-morning, on October 13th, sunlight streams through a small south-facing window and lands on a carved 8-pointed star near the altar. And October 13th, as any historian will tell you, was the day in 1307 when the arrests of the Templars began. For a medieval parishioner, that date would have held no sacred meaning at all. But for surviving Templars, it would have been burned into memory. The debate over whether such alignments are intentional or mere coincidence rages on. Skeptics insist that medieval builders, especially in rural areas, simply didn't have the mathematical precision required to create such effects with reliability. Supporters counter that knowledge of solar movement was well within the grasp of trained masons and that the very scarcity of these alignments suggests they were the work of people with specialized skills and specialized reasons. When you look at the carvings now, they no longer feel static. They seem, instead, like part of a dynamic, layered text animated by the movement of light. A symbol cut in shadow might appear incomplete until illuminated from exactly the right angle, revealing extra lines or shapes. Two carvings placed far apart might become linked when the light strikes them both at the same time. Sometimes, the effect might even require the viewer to stand in a specific spot to see the completed image, another way of ensuring that only those in the know could read the full message. Here, you feel the trail tighten. The idea of using light as a cipher key adds a new dimension to the code, a temporal one. Stone by itself is patient and immovable, but stone plus light becomes a living script, one that hides in plain sight. For all but a few minutes each year, those who knew the dates would know the message. Those who did not would walk past it forever, none the wiser. The warmth of it is surprising in the cool air of the nave. For a moment, you imagine the brothers who may have stood in this exact spot centuries ago, watching the same light strike the same mark, knowing they were part of something larger than themselves, a chain of sight and memory capable of spanning generations. The thought is exhilarating and unsettling. It means the church is not just a building, it is a clock, a calendar, and perhaps even a lockbox. And light, it seems, may be the only key. When the beam finally fades, you find yourself drawn to a different part of the church's section of wall, where floral carvings seem to bloom from the stone itself. At first glance, these details could be dismissed as mere decoration. Clusters of leaves, vines curling in graceful arcs, flowers rendered with painstaking attention to symmetry. But then your gaze rests on a single 5-petaled rose, and something stirs in the back of your mind. It is too perfect, too mathematically exact to be simple ornamentation. As your eyes adjust, you see another and another. Each rose is placed deliberately, almost as though marking an invisible path, one that no casual visitor would notice. The rose has deep roots in medieval iconography. In Christian art, it often appears in association with the Virgin Mary, symbolizing purity, divine love, and heavenly perfection. But for the Templars, and perhaps for whatever clandestine network may have survived their downfall, the rose may have carried an entirely different, more esoteric meaning. Combined with the cross, it formed a potent emblem, one later claimed, by certain secret societies, who professed descent from the order. Historically, the Templars used a variety of crosses. The most famous, of course, was the red cross patty worn on their white mantles, but floral and geometric variations appear too on seals, coins, and architectural details, and in some known Templar sites, the rose motif appears alongside crosses in ways that do not align with standard ecclesiastical designs. In some chapels, the rose is centered within a cross. In others, the petals themselves form the arms of the cross. This blending of botanical and geometric imagery was unusual for the times, suggesting deliberate intention rather than mere artistic flourish. What fuels speculation even more is the placement of these motifs. They appear in places not easily visible: the undersides of arches, the high reaches of clerestory walls, or deep in the shadows of side chapels. In one church in Aragon, a Roseanne cross carving is positioned above a doorway so small that anyone passing through must stoop them to bow before the symbol. Was that meant as reverence or as initiation? Here, the academic debate sharpens. Some historians argue that the Roseanne cross combination was purely decorative, a reflection of the medieval fascination with blending natural and geometric forms. Motifs appear in sequences that seem to mirror the layout of constellations. In particular, constellations tied to navigation and pilgrimage. If that is true, then perhaps these roses are more than decoration. Perhaps they are markers, a coded map hidden in plain sight, etched into the very skin of the church. A faint impression still lingers in your memory, almost like the ghost of a dream. That floral pattern you once brushed past without a second thought. Back then, it seemed strangely out of place, tucked away near the base of a column where no one would ordinarily notice it. But now, standing here again, with the Roseanne cross lens shaping your perception, you can't help but wonder, was that small carving the very first breadcrumb in a trail you had no idea you were already following? The thought prickles at the edge of your awareness. If the Templars really did place these symbols here, perhaps they were more than decorative flourishes. Perhaps they were deliberate markers, layered clues left behind for someone with the right knowledge to unravel. The rose, after all, has always been a potent emblem: beauty on the surface, secrecy at its heart. The cross, equally enduring, speaks of faith, of fraternity, of a shared purpose that spans generations. Together, they don't merely coexist, they merge into something greater. A kind of visual code hinting at the unity of the order's spiritual aspirations with its earthly, temporal ambitions. The question gnaws at you: was this code meant to be read one symbol at a time, each motif carrying its own fragment of meaning? Or were they pieces in a larger, carefully crafted sentence, designed to be understood only when seen as a whole? If it's the latter, then finding a single Roseanne cross pairing is barely the first step. It's the cruel genius of such a design offering, the intoxicating illusion that you've solved the puzzle, when in truth you've glimpsed only one shard of a much bigger picture. You lean closer to the stone, tracing the edge of one carved rose with the tip of your finger. The surface is worn smooth, polished by centuries of other hands that have lingered here. Were they accidental touches from passersby, or deliberate caresses by others who, like you, were searching, reading the stone as if it might one day answer back? The petals curl inward in a spiral, almost as though they're folding in on themselves, hiding something precious at their core. It's a design choice, yes, but it also feels intentional. Perhaps they really are guarding a secret. Perhaps, if you could follow this motif far enough across columns, across churches, across countries, it might lead you straight to the heart of the Templar code itself. You step back slowly, letting your eyes shift focus from the minute detail of the carving to the sweep of the entire building. The stone walls, the arched ceilings, the interplay of shadow and light. Each element was placed with care. And yet, a church is never merely an assembly of walls and arches. It's an alignment, a presence in the landscape, positioned not at random, but with a purpose. Medieval builders understood the land, the sun, and the stars. They laid foundations with intention. Sometimes that intention was theologically lining the altar toward the rising sun, as a symbolic gesture toward the Holy Land. Sometimes it was for spectacle, sunlight striking a certain stained glass at a precise hour on a feast day. But sometimes, perhaps, the reasons were far more obscure, crafted to be understood only by a select few. The Templars, both before and after their dramatic suppression, were no strangers to orientation. Their maritime operations demanded knowledge of wind, patterns, celestial positions, and bearings long before the compass became commonplace in Europe. Navigation was in their blood, and it's not difficult to imagine that such knowledge seeped into their architecture. Most medieval churches follow the eastward tradition, with the altar end facing the sunrise. But in certain sites tied to the Templars, this rule bends. In some cases, the structure is tilted a few degrees from true east. In others, its axis points toward landmarks far beyond the horizon, places no ordinary parishioner would have any reason to consider. Take, for example, the chapel in Lyon, France. Its axis is not aligned toward Jerusalem, as one might expect, but instead points directly toward the site of an old Templar commandery several miles away. Skeptics are quick to dismiss such deviations as the inevitable result of local topography or construction limitations. Yet precise measurements reveal the angle is too exact to be the byproduct of chance. Another example comes from rural Portugal, where a seemingly unremarkable church aligns perfectly with the setting sun on a date that doesn't match any saint's feast day, but does correspond precisely with the anniversary of a decisive Templar victory during the Reconquista. Patterns emerge when surveys are conducted in regions once known for post-suppression Templar activity. In several instances, the orientation of these churches aligns them in straight lines across the map, connecting multiple sites like beads on a thread. The question remains, were these alignments navigational aids, symbolic connections, or simply the natural consequence of skilled builders using familiar celestial references? The recurrence is difficult to ignore, especially when these lines connect sites with known Templar patrons. Historians are sharply divided. Some insist these alignments are nothing more than coincidence, artifacts of human pattern seeking amplified by modern mapping tools. After all, with enough points on a map, lines will inevitably form. Others maintain that the Templars, with their unmatched experience coordinating movement across continents, would have seen great value in embedding directional markers into their sanctuaries. If the stone code was meant to guide seekers not only toward ideas but toward physical places, then orientation could be one of its most discreet, yet powerful components. You recall an earlier insight. If light can be used to tell time striking, its mark only once a year, then alignment can be used to tell direction. The idea sticks. Imagine a visitor, centuries ago, standing in the nave of such a church. They would note the bearing of the altar or the position of a specific window and leave with a heading to follow. Combined with other clues perhaps, the sequence of rose and cross carvings or the number of steps between certain markers, a trail would emerge. A trail invisible to anyone without the key. You move to the center of the nave, now turning slowly, letting your eyes follow the architectural lines. There's a symmetry, yes, but it feels subtly askew, though the whole space is leaning toward something far beyond the walls. Outside, the wind stirs the trees. In your mind's eye, you picture a traveler from long ago stepping out from this doorway, not with a magnetic compass, but with a mental one built from stone, from the angle of sunlight, from the remembered whisper of a pattern. The church itself would have pointed the way, and the traveler would have obeyed. Stepping back into the light, you feel the fixed patience of the building. Year after year, it waits its message dormant until someone arrives who knows where to stand and which way to look. Somewhere along the line, perhaps, it points toward the next fragment of the Templars' hidden code, still waiting for discovery. When you return inside, your focus shifts. You've examined symbols in the stone, traced the light, measured the orientation. Now you begin to count, not absent-mindedly, as a casual visitor might tally pews, but with the slow, deliberate rhythm of someone who expects the numbers themselves to speak. The Templars were not merely warriors. They were men of rule and order, men who understood systems. Numbers, for them, were never just quantities. They were carriers of meaning, keys to understanding the world. In medieval sacred architecture, proportions often drew from theology or classical philosophy. Ratios inspired by biblical texts guided the dimensions, the relationship of nave to transept, the height of columns, the span of arches. But in certain churches, linked to the Templars or to those suspected of inheriting their traditions, these proportions stand apart from the norm. You notice it now, repeated numbers woven into the structure itself. 3 steps up to the altar, 7 narrow windows along the nave, 8 pointed stars etched into the floor. These are not arbitrary. They echo numbers with deep resonance in Templar history: 3 for the Trinity, 7 for spiritual perfection, 8 for the Beatitudes, and, in some readings, for the Templars' own 8-pointed cross. Historical records confirm that the Templars used specific ratios in their strongholds, and archaeological surveys reveal a consistent use of a 1:2 proportion in their walls and courtyards. A ratio favored for its pleasing harmony, and one also found in cathedral design. Such precision was not accidental. It was taught and preserved within the masons' lodges connected to the order. One example surfaces in a rural church in Languedoc, a region thick with Templar legends. Measurements show that the length of the nave, the width of the transept, and the distance from entrance to altar all reduce to whole number multiples of 11. In Christian numerology, 11 can symbolize imperfection or transgression, an odd choice for a church. Yet it also appears in Templar ciphers, where it marks the beginning of a hidden sequence. The precision is undeniable, and yet the meaning remains elusive. Detractors argue that such measurements are coincidental products of builders working with whatever space and materials they had. Supporters counter that the recurrence of these numbers, especially in sites tied to Templar patronage, points to a deliberate code. The debate intensifies when you consider the possibility of sequences embedded in the spacing of windows or column sequences that could, when paired with the right cipher, resolve into letters, words, or even dates. The logic begins to click into place. If the building's alignment could give direction, then its numerical proportions could give instruction. One leads you to the location, the other tells you what to seek when you arrive. And just like that, the stone around you feels less like an immovable monument and more like a silent guidebook, its language waiting for someone who knows how to read. 3 windows pierce the north wall, each one catching the pale light in a slightly different way. At first glance, they seem no more than architectural necessities, meant to let in the dim illumination that medieval masons so carefully orchestrated. But if you look closely, perhaps, just perhaps, they form part of a greater sequence. You can't help but wonder if they correspond to the third carving in some unseen order, as though the walls themselves are pages of a coded manuscript. A short distance away, 7 worn steps lead upward toward a small, shadowed alcove. There, ordinary enough until you notice something peculiar just above eye level. A faint mark catches your attention. It's subtle, almost swallowed by the centuries of dust and grime, but it's there. Could it be that the steps and the windows are not separate at all, but instead components of a single hidden code? Like the tumblers of an ancient combination lock, each piece by itself means little, but together they might unlock a truth the builders meant only for a select few to find. Your hand brushes along the curve of a nearby pillar. Its surface is cool and slightly rough beneath your fingertips. The vertical grooves, flutes carved with a precision that feels deliberate. You trace them, counting quietly. 12. The number settles in your mind like a small weight. 12 apostles, 12 tribes of Israel, 12 months in the year. In a Christian context, 12 is always significant. Yet here, in a church where whispers of Templar influence have lingered for generations, another possibility stirs. Could the 12 refer to the year 1312, the year the order was officially dissolved by papal decree? If so, was this pillar meant as a memorial, a warning, or a defiant declaration that they had endured, hidden in plain sight, long after their supposed destruction? The air is thick with the faint scent of candle wax, as if it's soaked into the stones over centuries. Your own soft counting still echoes faintly in your ears. This building feels like a puzzle box, a deliberate arrangement of shapes, numbers, and symbols designed to demand a methodical sequence before it will yield its secrets. Somewhere, you're certain, a final number waits to complete the code. But time is an unrelenting thief, and each year erodes the carvings a little more, blurring edges, softening lines, until one day they may be gone entirely. You decide to shift perspective entirely. Instead of looking at the church as it rises around you, you flatten it in your mind's eye, imagining yourself hovering high above, gazing down at its footprint. Architects call this the plan, a stripped-down geometry that ignores vertical splendor and reduces the sacred space to pure shape. In most medieval churches, the plan is predictable. The cruciform model, a long nave intersected by a shorter transept, creating the unmistakable outline of a cross. From above, it's a straightforward proclamation of faith. But here the lines feel subtly different. The proportions don't settle neatly into the expected ratios. The nave and the side chapels, for instance, some are placed with mathematical precision, echoing proportions you've already seen carved into columns and arches. Others lean toward asymmetry, their offsets slight, but enough to register once you've measured them in your mind. When plotted, these irregularities hint at shapes that resemble map patterns, pointing toward something beyond the walls themselves. In certain rare cases, the outlines of churches have been found to resemble the shape of a Templar cross, or even the outline of a fortress, but only when you ignore the vertical dimension and study the ground plan alone. History tells us that the Templars were pragmatic, yet symbolically precise, often building on sites with deep layers of meaning, sometimes reusing foundations from sacred pre-Christian sites. These older plans, often irregular and non-conforming to medieval norms, were not erased but woven into the new construction, producing subtle shifts in geometry that might escape the untrained eye. An especially curious example lies in a small hilltop church in Aragon. When its exact dimensions are drawn and the outer points connected in sequence, the result is a pentagonal shape rare in Christian architecture of the period but rich with esoteric symbolism. Stranger still, when the pentagon is overlaid onto a regional map, its vertices aligned with other sites rumored to have Templar ties. Coincidence? Many think so, but others argue such alignments are intentional, a kind of cartographic code preserved in stone. This is where the scholarly debate heats up. Some maintain that these quirks in geometry are simply the byproducts of adapting to uneven terrain or reusing earlier foundations. They dismiss the notion of hidden meaning as romantic overreach, but others, historians, architects, and a few persistent, independent researchers, argue that the recurrence of certain ratios, alignments, and patterns points to deliberate design. According to them, the church floor plan itself might serve as a mnemonic device, a memory aid. To an initiated Templar, walking through the space could trigger recollection of a journey, a sequence of locations, or even a ritual path encoded in the geometry beneath their feet. Standing now at the crossing point of the nave and transept, you feel an almost physical pull toward the unseen geometry. It's as if the lines radiate out from this spot, invisible but real, connecting to points far beyond the walls. You kneel and let your fingers skim the join where nav and transept meet. The stone here feels subtly different, smoother, more worn, as though it has borne the weight of countless feet pausing here for a reason beyond convenience. Was this the place from which the initiated oriented themselves before setting out on a journey guided by the church's hidden map? The idea lingers in the quiet, like a low organ note vibrating in your chest. You begin to see the building less as a static monument and more as part of a vast, unseen network. Each wall, each angled corridor, each deliberate measurement could be part of a design extending far beyond your current view. And somewhere out there, perhaps hundreds of miles away, other points of that same hidden geometry still exist, connected in ways that only their original designers fully understood. You turn toward the main entrance, stepping into the shadow cast by its massive arched doorway. Here, the language of the carvings changes. The walls and pillars up to now have been dominated by floral motifs, geometric patterns, and the occasional biblical scene. But at the portal, figures appear stone, guardians frozen mid-watch, their faces turned toward you. Their expressions are complex, somewhere between welcome and warning, as if weighing whether you are meant to pass. In most medieval churches, such figures are saints, angels, or symbolic animals drawn directly from Scripture. But here, as in certain other sites suspected of Templar connection, the details feel off. On your left, a lion crouches. Lions are common in church sculpture, but this one is different. Its body is angled inward, toward the church's interior, rather than outward, to guard against evil from without. Its mane is carved, not in simple waves, but in intricate spirals, each curled distinct, as though meant to be counted, perhaps even read like a script. On the opposite side, a robed human figure stands. The hood conceals most of the head, and where you expect to see a face, there is nothing, no nose, no mouth, just smooth stone, as if anonymity were deliberate. In one hand, the figure grips a sword, in the other, a small square object. At first, it seems like a book, but its proportions are unusual, and it lacks the clasp or binding details common to medieval depictions of Scripture. To someone familiar with Templar history, it might represent something else, entirely an object whose meaning would be obvious to the initiated, but invisible to outsiders. Historically, church portals were teaching tools for the illiterate. The carvings here, like those in countless other medieval churches, would have conveyed stories and moral lessons before a person even crossed the threshold. But some of these lessons feel more like riddles. In a small Templar-era chapel in central Portugal, two such guardian figures are robed in garments decorated with tiny, almost invisible, 8-pointed crosses. You'd have to pause and study them closely to even notice. What stands out across many of these sites is the recurrence of paired figures, one human, one animal. Sometimes the animal is exotic for the region, a camel, a monkey, even a griffin. Such creatures hint at influences from the Holy Land or from travelers who returned, with tales and images from distant lands. Were these pairings symbolic of virtues, or did they represent the brotherhood itself, one figure, a knight, the other his emblem, together, forming a kind of signature, carved openly, yet hidden in plain sight? Skeptics argue that these details are just the quirks of local craftsmen, borrowing freely from whatever stories, creatures, or symbols they knew. But others see too much repetition across too great a distance to dismiss. They suggest a shared design language, set of visual markers any initiated Templar would recognize instantly. In this interpretation, even the posture of the figures, the tilt of their heads, or the objects in their hands, could act as coded instructions. Think of it this way: a building's axis can align with a distant landmark. Now imagine applying that principle to sculpture. A carved figure's outstretched arm, frozen in stone for centuries, might point not at random, but directly toward another significant site. The animals, too, might serve as directional cues, their gaze fixed on a hidden path, or their stance angled toward the next location in a chain of clues. In such a system, the church itself becomes a compass not just in its plan, but in the silent gestures of its guardians. And so you find yourself lingering beneath the archway, reading not just the building, but the sentinels that flank its doors. They do not move, they do not speak, but perhaps, in their stillness, they are telling you exactly where to go next. A lion's tilted head might be more than just a sculptor's flourish. It could be a signal, a silent gesture frozen in stone, pointing toward the location of something hidden deep within the structure. The idea itself feels unsettling, even subversive. These lions, carved as noble guardians of the threshold, are supposed to embody vigilance and strength, to watch over the faithful as they enter. Yet, if this theory holds true, they might also serve as the keepers of an entirely different kind of secret. They are not merely protectors, they could be covert guides. You find yourself stepping closer, almost unconsciously, drawn into the quiet mystery radiating from the weather-worn stone. The years, no, the centuries, have left their mark. The lion's once crisp features are softened by the relentless patience of wind, rain, and time. You trace the faint grooves with your eyes, trying to read them the way one might read the wrinkles on a wise old face. Then your gaze catches on the mane, a series of tight, spiraling curls. They aren't just curls. In the sunlight of late afternoon, they glow faintly, as though catching and holding the light in their coils. You can't help but wonder, what if these spirals are more than mere decoration? What if each twist, each loop, is part of a code? The thought settles heavily in your mind. You can almost picture it, a mason's hands working the stone centuries ago, carving not just beauty, but instruction. Perhaps the spirals mark numbers. Perhaps the number of turns corresponds to the number of steps one must take once inside to reach the next sign. To most eyes, the mane is nothing but ornament. But to those initiated in a particular brotherhood's language, it could have been a map, and suddenly, the doorway before you transforms. It's no longer just an entrance into a place of worship. It becomes the first page of a manuscript. But this manuscript is not written in ink. It's inscribed in stone. Its letters hidden in flourishes. Its sentences disguised as architectural flourishes, waiting for those who know the key to read it. If the Templars, or whoever inherited their knowledge, were the ones who designed this portal, then these guardian beasts have not only been watching over parishioners for centuries, but guarding something far more clandestine. They might have been silent sentinels of a layered truth, one that the casual visitor would never suspect. You step past the lions, past the threshold they protect, and enter once more into the dim, cool interior of the church. But this time, you are not simply looking. This time, you are searching. Your eyes no longer drift automatically toward the soaring vaults overhead. Instead, they scan the walls, following the shapes and shadows of painted and carved figures that occupy every corner of the space. At first glance, it's much like any other church. Saints, martyrs, biblical heroes. The faithful could identify them by their traditional symbols. Peter with his keys, George with his dragon, John with his chalice. Centuries of Christian art have conditioned these images into a kind of visual shorthand. But here, something is different. Some of the figures don't fit the usual mold. Their armor is rendered with a precision that seems almost obsessive. This is not the generic armor of the distant Roman past that medieval artists so often imagined. These breastplates, helmets, and swords belong to the 13th century. They look like the tools of men who could walk out of the painting and join a real battlefield. And then there's the detail that chills you more than anything else. In certain places, faded almost to invisibility, a red cross still lingers on a shield, on a tunic, on the curve of a shoulder. It's subtle, easy to miss, but it's there. And that single mark speaks volumes. One historical fact supports the suspicion taking root in your mind. After the Templars were officially dissolved in the early 14th century, some churches commissioned new biblical artworks in these soldiers. From scripture, Roman centurions, temple guards were inexplicably depicted in the armor of contemporary knights. And not just any knights. Some of these armored men bore heraldic devices unmistakably tied to the Templar order. Designs used openly before their suppression, now hidden in plain sight as artistic choice. In one Italian fresco depicting the arrest of Christ, a soldier in the shadows carries a shield faintly marked with an 8-pointed star. Historically, that symbol has no link to Roman Palestine, but it was well known among certain knightly circles in medieval Europe, the Templars among them. It's the positioning of these figures that becomes truly curious. They rarely stand at the heart of the scene. Instead, they linger at its edges, a figure in the background, a guard in the corner, an onlooker at the fringe of the action. Their presence is subtle enough to escape notice unless one is specifically hunting for them. Yet once you begin to see them, you realize something. The artist has lavished more attention on these background figures than on some of the central ones. Their faces have character, their armor has weight, their stances have meaning. This detail divides scholars sharply. Some claim these knights are simply the result of artistic habit. Medieval painters often dressed biblical characters in the fashions of their own era, but others insist that the consistency of certain features, the same cross form, the same type of helmet, the same peculiar tilt of a sword, betrays a hidden intent. They argue these are not generic knights at all, but portraits in disguise, honoring the order long after its official end. Your mind returns to the lions at the entrance, to their tilted heads and spiral manes. What if the same principle applies here? What if the viewer was expected to count the hidden knights, to note their placement, even the direction of their gaze? Perhaps in a coded system, these elements functioned like coordinates. A knight looking toward the altar could signal that something of importance lies there. Another, facing the south transept, might be guiding the initiated toward a specific carving or a concealed chamber. In one chapel in southern France, you find a Last Supper scene. It's all very familiar. Christ at the center, disciples leaning in, but at the far right, barely touched by the glow of the central gathering, stands a solitary figure in chainmail, helmet cradled in the crook of one arm. His eyes are not on Christ, nor on the apostles. They are fixed on the doorway. 7 centuries have thinned the paint, yet the faintest trace of a red cross clings to his shoulder. Was he meant as a reminder to the faithful of the warriors who once guarded pilgrimage routes? Or was he a signal to those who could read the hidden language, a silent declaration that a knight still stood watch over whatever lay beyond that door? You walk the length of the wall, noting other marginal figures, some etched in stone relief, others rendered in the fading pigments of tempera. Each one feels like an echo from another time, whispering that the order's presence was never truly erased. It simply stepped out of the center stage and into the wings where fewer eyes would follow. Perhaps these were not merely tributes. Perhaps they were active participants in a secret communication system, a visual relay ensuring that the trail of meaning survived the centuries. Your gaze drifts upward again, following the slender columns as they rise and blossom into capitals, those carved crown-like tops that bridge column and arch. In most churches of the period, these capitals are miniature galleries. They teem with saints, angels, vines, scrollwork, even compressed scenes from Scripture, all crammed into a stone block no wider than your shoulders. But here, something stops you cold. Not all the capitals are decorated. A few are unfinished, not worn away by age, but deliberately abandoned mid-carving. On one side, crisp designs flourish. On the other, the stone remains perfectly smooth, untouched. At first glance, this could be explained away. Building projects ran out of money. Masons died. Replacements worked in different styles. Such irregularities are not rare. And yet, in certain churches, with rumored Templar influence, these incomplete capitals appear with a peculiar selectivity. One here, another far across the nave, another tucked away in the shadow of the transept arch. Every other capital around them is complete, ornate, finished. Only these few wear their emptiness like a badge. There is precedent for intentional incompletion. In some medieval stonemason traditions, leaving part of a work unfinished was a mark of humility, a symbolic admission that perfection belonged only to God. But the pattern here, the placement of these unfinished faces, feels less like humility and more like strategy. The bare surfaces often face toward particular features, a window, a wall carving, an architectural detail that itself contains suspected Templar symbols. In one rural Pyrenean chapel, 3 such unfinished capitals align directly with a pointed star above the chancel arch. In another, the blank side is bathed in light for only a few minutes on one specific day each year, a day that also triggers an unusual illumination of a distant wall carving. If these bare faces were intended as markers, they might be functioning as silent arrows, pointing the initiated from one clue to the next. Critics dismiss this as wishful thinking, random quirks of construction. But others note the recurrence of precise numerical groupings. 3 unfinished capitals in one site, 7 in another. Numbers that carry undeniable symbolic resonance. In the lore of the order, you remember the lion's spirals. You remember the knight's subtle glances. Now you add to that mental lexicon the language of absence, the possibility that what is missing may matter as much as what is present. An empty space is not always a void. To the trained eye, it could be the loudest signal of all. You stand beneath one such unfinished capital now, its smooth side catching the cool light from a narrow lancet window. The air feels stiller here, as though the very column is holding its breath. If you follow the direction it faces, will you discover the next piece of the code? Or is the blankness itself the message, a reminder that sometimes the most vital clue is the one you cannot see? Your footsteps lead you toward the rear of the church, where the baptismal font rests quietly in its corner. At first glance, It seems utterly unremarkable. A carved stone basin, worn to satin smoothness by the touch of centuries. Its surface bears the memory of countless ceremonies. Each drop of water, a tiny echo of faith. Each hand that touched it, a fragment of lives long gone. Fonts like this one are common in medieval churches, and their role has changed little over the centuries. From the moment they were placed, they were intended to serve a sacred function. The first threshold in a Christian life, the vessel of baptismal water, the setting for a ritual both ancient and unshakably symbolic. Even now, centuries after their carving, they still hold that role. And yet, as you lean in, peering closer at the stone, the surface begins to reveal whispers of another story. Up close, the carvings invite inspection. At first glance, you see the expected flourishes, curling vinework, careful bands of foliage, and familiar Christian iconography, the cross, the fish, the dove. But there's something more here. The rim of this font bears markings that resist easy explanation. They curve and twist in patterns that feel almost like fragments of another language, the kind of language that doesn't belong in a Latin church at all. The shapes are neither runes nor Roman letters. Their edges are softer, the angles sharper in strange places, their rhythm unfamiliar. One thing we know for certain: baptismal fonts were often carved before the rest of a church was even finished. Sometimes long before they could sit in place, while walls were still being raised, while roofs were yet to be tiled. The font, in many churches, is one of the oldest surviving objects in the building. A block of carved stone, older even than the door frames and window arches, that makes them unusually durable witnesses to the past. Unlike wood or plaster, they endure, and unlike altar cloths or paintings, they rarely get replaced. Because of that, a font would be the perfect place to hide something. It could hold a code that would survive renovations, political upheavals, even entire changes in decorative fashion. Generations could come and go, and the stone would remain. The water inside was holy, the kind of holiness that made people lower their eyes and whisper in reverence. But the stone beneath it could have carried a second, quieter purpose. What deepens the intrigue is this: certain motifs repeat on fonts found in regions known for a strong Templar presence. You notice it in patterns too specific to ignore. In a church in western France, for example, the font is ringed with 12 small shields, each carved in relief, each bearing a different design. Some show crosses, but not always the same kind. Some display stars, sharp-pointed, intricate. Others hold geometric knots, their lines looping in ways that could be purely decorative, but seem deliberate, as if each emblem recorded something specific. Far away in rural Portugal, another font tells a similar story. Around its outer rim runs a band of carvings that resemble navigational roses, like the ones sailors once drew on maps. But here's the curious part. Each is angled differently, tilted as if marking separate bearings. For most visitors, they're pretty patterns, but to someone with a mariner's eye, they could be coordinates, directions, stages of a journey that only the initiated would understand. Skeptics have their answer ready. They'll say this is all just heraldry, decorative borrowing. A craftsman might have copied symbols from local coats of arms or guild crests simply because they looked impressive. Perhaps the shields belonged to donors, Perhaps the compass shapes were just a stonemason's whimsy. But those who believe in a hidden purpose point out that baptismal fonts, while central to the Church's rites, sit in a strange position. They're important enough to be preserved, yet peripheral enough to avoid close scrutiny from authorities. Anyone could approach one without raising suspicion. After all, it's the natural place to stand, to touch the water, to baptize a child, that made it ideal for hiding a code in plain sight. And perhaps, in some cases, the code wasn't hidden in the absence of decoration, the way a blank space might serve as a subtle marker, but rather in its abundance, a dense, seemingly chaotic ring of carvings, each a piece of a larger message. Imagine the initiated knowing exactly which symbols to read, in what sequence. The font's circular shape providing a natural loop for continuous information. Even the water itself could have played a role in this symbolism, a mirror, a lens. The ripples distorting and shimmering over the carvings, a reminder that truth might shift in appearance, that messages might require cleansing or reflection before they could be seen clearly. One striking example comes from Spain. The basin's inner walls are smooth, or so they seem at first. But when light is angled just so, faint lines emerge, shallow as a whisper in stone. Trace them, and they form a diagram, curves and intersections that eerily resemble the old pilgrimage routes to Santiago. Was it meant as a guide for those setting out on a dangerous road? Or was it a spiritual metaphor given physical form? A reminder that baptism marked both a sacred beginning and, for some, a literal journey. You run your fingers along the cool rim of the font, feeling the shallow grooves. Centuries ago, a child would have been cradled here, their family crowded, close, water dripping on their forehead. They would have been oblivious to the idea that beneath their hands lay an entirely different story, a message meant not for the innocent, but for those trained to see past the water's surface. The light in the church has thinned. Afternoon. Shadows grow longer, and you step outside into the cooling air to walk the perimeter. You've already seen how sunlight can unlock carvings inside, how the angle of a beam can suddenly make invisible marks appear. But here, outside, the church reveals another kind of language, one written not in stone, but in the alignment of the building itself. The Templars, inheriting knowledge from both Islamic scholars in the East and the ancient builders of Europe, saw the sky as more than a distant spiritual realm. It was a clock, a map, a guide as precise as any compass. Aligning a structure with the heavens was an act of power as well as beauty. We know that many medieval churches were designed so that their altar faced the sunrise on the feast day of their patron saint. But in certain places with Templar connections, the alignments don't match the saint's day. Instead, they match moments important to the order itself, anniversaries of victories or foundations, or the infamous date of October 13th, 1307, when the Templars were arrested en masse. In Burgundy, there's a small chapel where, at dawn, on October 13th, the rising sun pours through a narrow slit in the eastern wall. For just a few minutes, the light strikes a carved sword on the opposite wall, illuminating it before sliding away. The effect is fleeting but unmistakable. In Portugal, surveys of several Templar sites show something even more curious. Their main axes don't just match solstice or equinox sunrises. They align with the rising of certain stars. most notably Sirius, a star tied to navigation and to ancient Egyptian and early Christian symbolism. A casual worshipper would never notice this, but someone trained to read the sky would. Historians argue about whether these alignments are intentional or coincidence. Critics say that with so many possible celestial events, you can always find one that matches a given orientation. But the fact that the same few stars recur across distant sites, and stars that are visible only during certain brief windows each year, suggests precision, not accident. If you wanted a code to last for centuries, what better way than to anchor it in the sky? The stars would rise in their appointed places long after wars, regimes, and even languages had changed. You think of the carvings you saw inside, revealed by sunlight. Now the concept seems broader. A church could be a timepiece, its very shape and orientation designed to capture one singular moment each year. A traveler could arrive before dawn, waiting for the instant a chosen star rose above the horizon to confirm their path forward. Sometimes the alignment might work in layers. A church aligned to the solstice sunrise might also have carvings on its floor that echoed the same event. The sky and the stone telling the same story, one confirming the other. You stand at the eastern wall, the sun now low. In your mind's eye, the modern clutter of buildings melts away. You see the open horizon as it would have looked centuries ago, the stars sharp against the dark sky. A hooded figure stands here, scanning the heavens, waiting for the moment when the sky and the earth speak together. Then they step inside, ready for the next part of the message. Back in the dim candlelight of the church, you notice something underfoot. Near the west entrance, the stone floor carries a pattern unmistakable in its form, a labyrinth. Its spirals are cut deep into the stone, precise and deliberate. This one is small compared to the great labyrinths of Chartres or Amiens, but here, in a rural church, its presence is strange enough to provoke questions. In the medieval church, labyrinths were devotional tools. Pilgrims might walk their paths. In prayer, a symbolic journey to Jerusalem for those who could not make the actual pilgrimage. Their winding lines represented the twists and trials of spiritual life, ending inevitably at God's presence in the center. But in churches with suspected Templar ties, the labyrinths are different. Their proportions deviate from the standard. Designs, the number of circuits changes. The angles of the turns are unexpected. The entrance isn't always where you'd think it should be. The Templars, during their campaigns in the Holy Land, would have seen labyrinths in Islamic art and in ancient ruins. In some of those places, the spiral was not a metaphor at all. It was a diagram, a literal map of routes, or the layout of a fortress, or the structure of a city's defenses. If you brought that idea back to Europe, you could lay such a map on the floor of a church. To most parishioners, it would be a holy path. To the informed, it might be a set of instructions carved into stone, walked over daily, ignored by all but those who knew how to read it. An obscure detail comes to light from a site survey deep in the rolling landscapes of southern France, a place where the air carries that peculiar stillness found in old stone churches, and the light itself seems to sift down in measured, deliberate shafts. The focus of the discovery was not a wall or a fresco, but something lying almost flat against the earth, a labyrinth. At first glance, it might seem no more than a decorative flourish, a curious pattern pressed into the stone floor by artisans of a bygone age. But when this labyrinth is carefully overlaid with a compass and measured against its own intricate proportions, something startling emerges. Its curves and lines, each twist, each turn, begin to align with the positions of other nearby sites long associated with the Templars. The match is not rough or approximate, but almost exact, as though the paths had been drawn to scale with destinations in mind. Each bend in the path seems to point deliberately toward a specific place. If this was intentional, then the labyrinth was not simply an image to be admired or walked in contemplation. It was a miniature mapan encoded, network of points and directions carved into stone, hiding in plain sight beneath the feet of worshippers and pilgrims. In academic circles, the debate over this kind of find echoes familiar arguments surrounding other supposed Templar codes, numerical sequences, compass alignments, and symbolic architecture. Skeptics insist that such correspondences are coincidences, the result of medieval artisans working from memory or improvising patterns for purely aesthetic effect. They point out that labyrinths have been found in many churches across Europe, with no connection to the order at all. Yet the counter-argument is hard to dismiss. Supporters of the coded map theory highlight the unusual complexity of certain labyrinths, their almost mathematical symmetry, the way proportions are repeated with uncanny precision. They also draw attention to small, telling anomalies, symbols, or letters carved subtly into the very turns of the path, invisible unless one kneels close enough to inspect the grooves. These are not embellishments the casual eye would notice, and their placement suggests they were meant for a select few who knew how to read them. It is here that memory stirs, perhaps of another pattern seen elsewhere, a rhythm once counted in steps or windows, now coiled into this tight, winding shape. The labyrinth could, in this interpretation, be a condensed, portable form of a much larger idea, a network of sacred or strategic points reduced to a single surface. To the initiated, tracing its route in a particular way, counting, turns, noting, direction changes might yield numbers, letters, even instructions. Each bend could correspond to a specific value, each value to a letter, each letter to a place or an action. Kneeling now, you let your fingers glide along the worn stone channels. Time has smoothed them, centuries of feet and knees and hands pressing against them in quiet devotion. Yet here and there, the carving remains sharp, as though preserved by some intent. It's not difficult to imagine a lone Templar, perhaps stripped of rank, cast out publicly, but privately still sworn to the order's cause, coming here at dawn, or at the violet hush of dusk. In the flicker of a single candle, he might run, his fingers over the same path, eyes narrowing in concentration as he commits the pattern to memory before setting off to follow the route it encoded. Seen from above, the labyrinth is a puzzling enigma, coiled in stone, daring to be solved. Walked from within, it becomes a journey, a slow, spiraling progression toward something concealed. And perhaps, in the minds of its makers, it was both. A door disguised as devotion, a step in the greater code that promised to lead beyond the church's walls, far into the countryside where other secrets waited. The image of its spirals lingers in your mind as you move deeper into the church. The path leads toward a shadowed alcove tucked against the north transept, The air here is cooler still, edged with a faint scent of dust and age, and the carvings along the walls seem to shift in the half-light as you move, as though the stone itself were reluctant to show its full meaning at once. At the heart of the alcove stands a relief panel, its surface darkened and softened by centuries. Your eyes settle on a shape subtle but unmistakable, a chalice. Its bowl is shallow and wide, the stem slender and balanced, carved with such precision that even in the dim light it catches a muted gleam. Historically, the association between the Knights Templar and the Holy Grail is a child of legend, not of record. Contemporary documents from the order, where they survive at all, make no direct mention of such a relic. The mythos of the Templar Grail took shape much later, woven from the threads of romance, literature, and the imaginations of chroniclers long after the order's fall. Yet, in the medieval world, the chalice was a potent symbol. It was the vessel of Christ's blood, the container of sacred mystery. For an order accused, rightly or wrongly, of heresy and secret rites, the chalice would have been the perfect emblem for a hidden truth too dangerous to proclaim aloud. In ordinary church art, chalices appear often enough, usually linked to the Eucharist or the Passion. But in places where the Templars held influence, the motif sometimes shows up in less obvious contexts, carved into door lintels, tucked into the marginal designs of capitals, or hidden within decorative panels unrelated to the liturgy. In one chapel in western Spain, for instance, a small chalice sits at the feet of a knight in a fresco of the crucifixion, a placement with no clear theological precedent, yet suggestive of a signal only some would recognize. More curious still are those chalices shown alongside paired symbol stars, roses, certain stylized crosses. In some examples, the chalice does not hold wine or blood, but rather catches a shaft of light or a descending star. These are not standard liturgical images. Were they allegories for divine inspiration, or something more concrete, directions to a place, a clue to a relic, an indication of some guarded object? As always, scholarly opinion divides. Skeptics dismiss the entire Grail connection as a romantic overlay, the result of centuries of storytelling grafted on to sparse facts. Believers note the persistence of chalice imagery in places touched by the order, especially when it appears in the company of other suspected code elements, numbers, compass, roses, unconventional iconography. In their view, the chalice might not have represented the Grail itself, but the ultimate objective of the Templar code, whatever form that truth took. Your thoughts return briefly to the compass-like marks seen earlier on a baptismal font. If that was a sign of beginnings, perhaps this was a marker for the end of a journey. Whether that journey led to a physical site or to an inner revelation, the chalice could serve as both a promise and a map. Leaning closer, you notice something odd. The chalice here is not perfectly symmetrical. The rim dips slightly lower on one side, and the stem is just off-center. To a casual observer, it might seem an imperfection in the carving. But if this offset points toward a particular spot in the church, much as the gaze of certain carved knights appears to it, might be a directional marker. Following its implied line, you see that it leads toward a narrow doorway in the far wall, so small you might have missed it entirely. The air feels tighter now, as though it too is watching. You picture yourself, centuries ago, slipping through that doorway at the silent prompting of a symbol half hidden in shadow, a secret known only to those who looked twice. If the Templars intended this as a clue, it was a subtle one, just enough to draw the attention of the observant without revealing itself to the uninitiated. You step through. The doorway leads into a smaller, darker chapel, its silence deep enough to feel. A faint glimmer of color draws your eye upward to a stained glass window. At first it appears unremarkable, saints in robes, scrolls unfurling, perhaps a fragment of a biblical story. But something is off. A bird soars upside. A cross tilts at a strange, deliberate angle. A banner's letters run backward, as if meant to be read in a mirror. Stained glass in the medieval period was not merely decorative, it was a narrative medium, teaching scripture to those who could not read. The work was painstaking, pane of colored glass, shaped, set in lead, and placed with precision. To reverse an image, to mirror its elements, was not an accident. It took intention. In certain churches linked to the Templars, this mirroring recurs, appearing only in select panels, often those that seem slightly out of sequence with the surrounding images. And in the dusty pages of medieval guild manuals, there is mention of inversion, used deliberately for symbolic purposes, especially in alchemical imagery. Reversal, it was said, could signify that meaning lay hidden, accessible, only when seen from the right perspective. One case stands out. In a chapel in central France, a stained glass window shows a knight kneeling before an altar. On his shield is an 8-pointed star, reversed, its symmetry flipped along a vertical axis. Viewed normally, it looks subtly wrong. But place a mirror opposite the window, and the star aligns perfectly. No other part of the scene requires such adjustment. Was this a mistake by the craftsman, or a test-an invitation to the viewer to consider reflection itself, both literal and figurative, as the key to understanding? Critics insist on the former, suggesting that artisans reused patterns without perfect fidelity. But proponents note the precision of these inversions, and the fact that they appear only in select windows, often alongside other suspected Templar markers. Numbers embedded in the composition, directional cues in the angles of figures, symbolic pairings with roses, stars, and chalices. Here, the glass does not merely catch the light, it bends it, distorts it, and perhaps, if one knows how to look, reveals something far beyond the surface. A memory stirs a lesson from earlier in your journey, one that never truly left you. It whispers from the edges of thought. Light can reveal what shadow conceals. You recall a moment when sunlight filtered through ancient glass, unveiled symbols that darkness had hidden for centuries. Back then, the discovery was simple, a direct interplay between illumination and secrecy. But here, in this chapel, the light offers not clarity, but a challenge layered with complexity. What if the image was never meant to be seen in this room at all? What if its truest form could only be found elsewhere, reflected, refracted, or mirrored on another surface, in another location, perhaps even in another building entirely? You picture two churches, separated by streets or fields, each holding a fragment of the whole, complementary panels of colored glass, their designs reversed like the halves of a riddle. Individually, each is incomplete, but together, when aligned, they would form a single coherent instruction. It is a thought that forces you to widen your gaze, to stop thinking of this building as an isolated, sacred space and start considering it as part of a network, a deliberately connected system. You lean back against the cool stone wall, letting your eyes lose focus. The stained glass melts into blurred mosaics of red, blue, and gold, colors no longer sharp but bleeding into one another, shimmering with the glow of centuries. In that softened vision, the reversed bird in the window shifts in meaning. Its mirrored wings seem to point beyond the frame, across the chapel, toward the far wall. There, a second window, smaller, almost modest in comparison. It's easy to overlook, but once you know what to look for, the pattern emerges. Hidden among the colored panes are shapes that repeat the mirrored theme, though less boldly than the first. They are quieter clues, the sort that only speak to someone already searching. A scene unfolds in your imagination. A traveler from centuries past enters this very space. They carry with them not a prayer book, but a polished metal disc or a small hand mirror, not unusual items for the time, but tools in the right hands. They stand here, perhaps at dusk, when the low light catches the glass in just the right way. They hold the mirror up at a precise angle, aligning it so both windows, the large and the small, appear together in its reflection. In that moment, scattered fragments of color resolve into a complete image, a hidden instruction. The thought unsettles you. Here is a message that demands the reader quite literally reverse their perspective. Flip the world as they know it, before it will give up its meaning. And if the Templars placed such codes here, then secrecy was not their only aim. Transformation was. Only those willing to change the way they see could ever progress. You leave the side chapel and return toward the nave, though your focus is no longer on the windows or even the painted saints. Your attention drifts forward to the altar. It is, after all, the heart of the building, the place where the sacred and the human converge. In most medieval churches, an altar is a solid, immovable block of stone or wood, sometimes holding relics of saints sealed inside for eternity. This is well-documented tradition and theology bound together in physical form. But among certain circles, whispered stories suggest that in Templar times, some altars concealed far more than holy remains. History does record that crypts beneath altars were common throughout medieval Europe. They often served as resting places for saints, or as foundations that incorporated fragments of older, sacred buildings. Yet, in certain churches connected directly or indirectly with the Templars, excavations have revealed anomalies. Sealed chambers appear where no parish record mentions their construction. In other cases, voids invisible to the naked eye are detected by modern ground-penetrating radar. One case in Aragon stands out. A cavity beneath an altar, large enough for a person to crouch inside, was discovered by accident. Within it lay fragments of ancient parchment and the broken hilt of a sword. No inscription, no obvious explanation, just enough to spark speculation and enough to keep its secrets intact. There is another, subtler pattern. In a handful of medieval churches, the altar is slightly misaligned with the building's main axis. It breaks the perfect symmetry one expects in sacred architecture. When these deviations are measured, they sometimes align with compass bearings, pointing toward other sites tied to Templar history. Could the altar itself have been designed as a navigational marker? Here scholars divide sharply. The cautious explain the misalignments as practical matters, shifting ground, errors in measurement, or the reuse of older foundations. But others argue that when such offsets recur alongside other coded elements, specific counts of steps from the entrance, geometric patterns in the floor, the likelihood of coincidence shrinks. To them, the altar was more than an object of devotion. It was a fixed point in a vast, encoded map. The memory of a larger compass returns to you, the way an entire building's orientation once seemed to link with distant landmarks. What if that principle had been miniaturized? What if the altar itself was the needle, its precise placement indicating not just heavenward focus, but a horizontal bearing toward something or somewhere else? If the Templars did hide objects or knowledge beneath their altars, their positioning would have been crucial. To open the wrong one, or at the wrong time, might mean finding nothing, or worse, being discovered. And then there are the whispered tales of what an initiated visitor might have done here. They could kneel at the altar, appearing to pray, while in reality counting the paving stones beneath their knees, each number corresponding to a letter or a direction. Their fingers might trace the carved relief along the altar's base, feeling for a latch or seem invisible to the eye. They might wait for the exact day and hour when sunlight, streaming through a specific window, touched a single mark on the altar's surface, the sign that a hidden panel could be opened without risk. You step closer now, running your own hand lightly along the edge of the present-day altar. The stone is cool, worn smooth by centuries of cloth coverings and reverent hands. But in one corner, you feel it, an irregularity. The join between two blocks is wider here than anywhere else. It could mean nothing. Statues of saints pointing toward unexpected corners. Chalices with stems that seem deliberately off-center. Each of them could have been steps on a path leading here to the heart of the ritual space. If something lies beneath this point, it has waited longer than any one lifetime. It has been guarded not only by stone and shadow, but by a language understood only by those who have already passed every other test. When you finally step outside, the evening is fading. The last light glances across the rough cobblestones that lead away from the church. You can almost hear the echoes of centuries, the boots and hooves of travelers, the murmur of merchants speaking in many tongues, the clink of coins at the market stalls that once lined the road. For the Templars were more than warriors. They were protectors of pilgrimage routes, caretakers of the steady stream of souls bound for holy destinations. Their commanderies often sat at critical crossroads, offering shelter, food, and safety. And this network, fortified bridges, guarded passes, and way stations, gave them not only influence over travel, but the perfect means to move information discreetly. Along these roads, patterns emerge. Certain symbols repeat themselves, at intervals too precise to ignore, carved into bridge supports, etched into roadside waymarkers, hidden in the cornerstones of chapels. In southern France, the eight-pointed star appears again and again, always facing the direction of travel. Near the end of the Camino de Santiago, in Galicia, churches display roses and crosses that a pilgrim approaching from the east would encounter in perfect sequence. Whether this was intentional guidance or coincidence is debated fiercely. Skeptics say such symbols were common across Europe, popular among artisan guilds and decorative traditions. Believers note the placement, often at decision points, along a route, as if to quietly steer the traveler onward. The floor plans and compass alignments you've studied inside now feel connected to what you see out here. If the code within the church pointed outward, then these waymarkers might be the next phase of the trail, a path that could lead from site to site until the ultimate destination was reached. A pilgrim might walk the obvious holy journey, while unknowingly tracing a second hidden path. One account from the 15th century, long after the order was officially dissolved, tells of a traveler guided by a sequence of carvings to a remote chapel known only to the brothers. The description is sparse, almost deliberately vague, but it suggests a journey with two layers, spiritual and practical, converging in a place still bound by Templar secrecy. As you walk the church's perimeter, you notice a small carving near the base of the outer wall, facing the old road. A simple star, weathered nearly smooth, its points softened by centuries of wind and rain. It faces directly toward a distant ridge. Coincidence, perhaps. Or perhaps, as so often in this puzzle, it is a piece meant to be invisible to all but those who already walk the path it marks. Back inside, your gaze drifts lower, to the bases of columns, to the narrow seams where stone meets stone. Here, far from the grand flourishes of capitals and stained glass, are marks most visitors never notice. Simple lines, triangles, curves, initials. To an untrained eye, they are nothing, scratches, the erosion of time, but you know better. In the world of medieval stonework, marks are rarely accidents. Each was deliberate, personal, and in some cases, deeply secretive. The mason's marks, those small, almost inconspicuous symbols etched into stone, were far more than mere artistic flourishes. In medieval construction, they were the fingerprints of the builders, signatures used for accounting and quality control. When a church or castle was complete, these marks served as proof of a craftsman's contribution, a silent way to track the labor that had gone into raising walls and vaults. Each stone carried the identity of the hands that shaped it. Across much of Europe, from England to the Levant, they follow a pattern: triangles, chevrons, zigzags, variations on stars or crosses, motifs that appear again and again in guild records. But in certain places, particularly in churches or strongholds associated with the Order of the Temple, there are marks that don't belong to any known guild catalogue. They break the mold. A cross enclosed within a perfect square, an 8-pointed star formed from 2 overlapping strokes, parallel lines intersecting at a slant that no medieval handbook records. These were not idly chosen, and they are not isolated occurrences. Some of them appear again and again, separated by hundreds of miles, carved into structures that share no obvious architectural lineage except their link to the Templars. The pattern grows stranger the closer one looks. In a number of documented cases, these unusual marks are not found in places where the public could easily see them. Instead, they're buried deep inside the bones of a building, carved on the hidden face of a supporting stone, pressed into the underside of a beam, or hidden behind plaster. Once the structure was complete, no passerby could have noticed them. This is not the behavior of a craftsman seeking recognition. It suggests a different audience altogether, fellow builders, future restorers, or perhaps only a select few who knew to look in the right places. One example comes from a small chapel in Portugal. During a 20th century repair, workers discovered a carving on the underside of a roof beam, 3 interlinked triangles, so clean and deliberate that it looked almost modern. Its match was later found 400 kilometers away on the base of a column in a Templar commandery. The two sites had no direct political connection. The odds of this repetition being accidental are, at best, slim. Here the scholars diverge. Some argue that, while the Templars certainly employed masons, and often the best of their time, there's no direct proof of a shared symbolic language between the order and the later traditions of Freemasonry. They see the marks as either coincidental or as remnants of local traditions, but others take the opposite stance. They note that these non-standard marks recur with uncanny persistence in buildings tied to Templar activity. For them, these signatures were not just practical, they were encoded confirmations, signals that the site belonged to a wider, perhaps even secret, network. It's a reversal of the familiar detective's maxim. Sometimes the absence of something is the clue, but here the tiniest addition, a chiseled curve, an extra intersecting line, might carry the key. What if a certain symbol meant this is a waypoint, while another meant turn here or seek below? If the theory holds, the real challenge is separating the handful of functional signs from the hundreds of ordinary marks left by honest stonecutters. You find yourself kneeling at the base of a column, fingertips brushing a symbol, a spiral set within a square. The carving is crisp despite centuries of weather and candle smoke. It's too exact to be a casual flourish. You've seen this spiral before, in the mane of the lion guardian that sits outside the church's entrance. That repetition is not something to dismiss lightly. Could the same mason have left both? Or perhaps someone from his circle, inheriting not just tools, but an esoteric tradition? If that's true, then the Templar code might have been passed down not only through architecture and symbols, but literally through the hands of those shaping the stone, a brotherhood hidden within a brotherhood. Their work would be indistinguishable from ordinary craft to the untrained eye, but a silent language to those who knew how to read it. And to fully decipher it, you'd have to think like they did, not just as a pilgrim or a knight, but as a builder whose legacy lies in the smallest, most easily overlooked corners. Your steps carry you toward the chancel. The choir stalls stand in precise, orderly rows, their dark oak polished to a soft sheen by generations of hands. At first glance, they're purely functional sturdy seating for the monks or canons who once chanted the daily offices. But closer inspection reveals a world hiding in plain sight. The armrests, the misericords beneath the folding seats, the back panels, all teem with life. Tendrils of foliage curl into impossible spirals, animals crouch in mid-pounce, and human faces emerge from the wood, each one unique, with a sculptor's careful attention to individuality. In medieval Europe, misericords were often playgrounds for the carver's imagination. Here, hidden under the seats, they could indulge in humor, satire, and scenes from everyday life without the constraints of strictly religious iconography. Grotesques grimace, foxes preach to geese, and peasants wrestle with improbable fish, all the visual jokes. The church's hierarchy might frown upon in more prominent places, but in some churches linked to Templar patronage, the tone changes. Here, tucked beneath the surface, where only the clergy would see them, appear images that are different, crosses of strange design, stylized roses, compasses, geometric knots that echo the stone tracery of windows and the patterns of tiled floors. These are not random. They echo motifs that appear elsewhere in the building's architecture, and, in some cases, they mirror symbols found in Templar seals or relics. One church in northern Spain offers a particularly striking example. Along one side of its choir stalls, the misericords progress in a sequence: a star, then a chalice, then a mounted knight, then a ship with billowing sails. The other side reverses this order, as if reflecting the journey back again. To the casual eye, it could be a devotional narrative, but to an initiate, it might have marked stages of a pilgrimage, steps of an oath, or even a coded instruction. Again, the scholars divide. The skeptics dismiss it as coincidence, the playful whim of craftsmen in spaces where bishops and patrons rarely inspected the details. The believers, however, point to the sheer number of times these particular symbols recur in Templar-linked sites. They argued that this was communication by design, a visual language meant for the eyes of those who lived and worked within the church walls. If the mason's marks were a silent code in stone, perhaps these carvings were the equivalent in wood, and wood, unlike stone, invites touch. A stone mark might be glimpsed by a traveler, but these designs could be studied, even traced by hand, only by those allowed into the choir. It's easy to imagine a novice, newly admitted into some outer circle of the brotherhood, being shown exactly which misericord to study, which image to commit to memory, and in what order. You let your fingertips follow the grain of one carved armrest. The grooves are deep, cut more than 6 centuries ago. The figure here is a hooded man, his head turned away. In his hands, he holds something too small to be a sword, too large for a coin. Time has blurred its edges. Was it deliberately ambiguous, even when first carved? The longer you look, the more it feels as though the choir stalls are not still at all, that they're murmuring among themselves, whispering from one set of knowing hands to the next, going quiet the moment an outsider approaches. The next morning, rain has washed the air clean. The light slants in soft and silver, the scent of damp stone rising from the walls. You begin another slow circuit of the church, but this time you're not looking for what's there. You're looking for what's missing. It's natural to assume that any missing carvings, paintings, or symbols have simply fallen victim to time. Yet the more carefully you look, the more certain gaps feel intentional. Some erasures are too precise, too deliberate, as if someone took tools to the surface with purpose. History offers context here. Iconoclasm, the deliberate destruction of images, has erupted across Europe in many waves, in moments of political upheaval, religious reform, or even personal vendetta. Thousands of medieval artworks were defaced or destroyed in the name of purity or change. But in certain Templar-linked churches, the missing imagery seems oddly selective. In one church, every carved capital on a column row is intact, except one. Its central figure has been gouged away so thoroughly that nothing remains but a hollowed patch of stone. In another, A fresco of saints survives almost unscathed, except that a single emblem, a star or rose, has been scraped down to bare plaster. And then there's the case from Languedoc, a chancel screen whose carved shields have all survived but one. The missing shield's position is intriguing. Directly opposite a window known to cast a beam of sunlight onto that spot during the winter solstice. Was the missing image part of some alignment or ritual? In another church, a set of floor tiles displays intricate geometric designs in red and cream, except for a single tile near the altar. That one is plain stone, cut just slightly off from the others, as though the original was lifted out and replaced. It's not the randomness of age, it's the precision of a choice. Here, the disagreement among scholars takes on two familiar shapes. Some maintain that these erasures, these deliberate absences in stone, wood, and plaster, are nothing more than the unintended scars of time. They speak of accidental damage, of restorations gone wrong, of the enthusiastic but misguided zeal of later generations who sought to erase what they judged as heresy. To them, each missing face, each rubbed-out carving, each scraped panel is merely the natural attrition of centuries. Others, however, argue for precision, for intent. They claim that these removals were surgical, deliberate, and meaningful. In this telling, the erasures are no accidents at all, but part of a plan, executed either by those who sought to obliterate the Templar code from the face of history, or by those who were desperate to protect it. In the latter view, the most revealing fragments were taken away before hostile eyes could study them, smuggling meaning out of harm's reach. A lesson echoes here, one you've encountered before, that absence itself can be a signal. You've seen it in the blank faces of unfinished capitals, where the missing becomes a message. Perhaps these gaps are not simply voids, not simple casualties of time, but markers left by those who knew what they were doing. And if you knew the original arrangement, if you could see the work as it once stood, then the missing piece might whisper a direction. It might tell you where to look next, or hint at what crucial element had been spirited away to another hiding place. You move along the north wall. There, your eyes catch the faint outline where a carving once lived. The chisel marks are sharp, too sharp for weather or slow erosion. This is the mark of human hands, of deliberate removal. The shape resists interpretation at first, but as your eyes trace the ghostly curve, a pattern begins to emerge. A circle, a cross, perhaps. Though the thought is cautious, the old Roseanne cross motif. Following the wall, you reach a patch of plaster that looks different from the rest. It's newer, its pale tone not yet darkened by age and dust. The temptation is immediate, irresistible, to imagine that beneath that smooth and innocent surface lies the symbol intact, hidden, not destroyed, waiting, as if holding its breath, for the moment when the outer layer is stripped away. The thought is unsettling. If parts of the code have already been removed, then those absences carry their own danger. Were they taken away to bury them forever, or to keep them safe? And yet, not everything has been erased. The very selectiveness of the vanishings suggests purpose and hope. Enough remains to trace the pattern, if you have the patience, to read silences alongside the words carved into stone. By now, you've traced symbols in shadow. You've counted the silent language of stone. You've followed alignments of light and compass. You've noted the deliberate gaps where something was taken away. Each on its own feels like a fragment without a hole. But standing in the nave once more, you sense something different. The fragments are beginning to converge. The trail, if you've read it rightly, leads here to something that hides in plain sight. It is so ordinary, so perfectly integrated into the church's architecture, that no casual visitor would ever pause to question it. We know one historical fact with certainty. Medieval builders often reused elements from older structures, columns, paving stones, entire doorways salvaged from ruins, transported across landscapes, set into new buildings. These recycled pieces could carry inscriptions or designs that had nothing to do with their new setting. In sites linked to the Templars, there are documented examples of such reused elements placed in oddly prominent positions, as though their preservation were no accident, as though their survival was part of a plan. Field researchers have noted a recurring anomaly, a single feature, often in the most visible spot in the building, that quietly violates the rules of symmetry. It might be the central paving stone before the altar in a Portuguese chapel, its grain and color distinct from all the rest. Under a certain light, a shallow engraving emerges there, a compass rose surrounded by numbers. Or in a French church, the boss at the center of the vault, directly above the congregation, holds a star pattern, not any liturgical symbol, but one that, when laid over a map, matches the arrangement of nearby Templar sites. Scholars argue endlessly over these details. Skeptics say they are quirks of construction, nothing more than medieval improvisation. Believers counter with probability. How many times must such anomalies appear before coincidence is ruled out? And if you wished to hide something important in plain sight, would this not be the perfect place? You think back over your journey, the roses and crosses hidden in shadow, the painted knights leaning out from the margins, the unfinished capitals that catch light only on certain dawns, the fonts, the labyrinths, objects that might double as maps. Each element could stand alone, but together they feel like layers of a single design. If the Templars, or those who came after, truly meant to pass on a message, they would need a final marker, something unmistakable to confirm for the seeker. You have arrived. In this church, your gaze rises to the keystone above the main arch. It is modest, almost shy, next to the grandeur of the surrounding stonework, but the carving is sharp, suspiciously sharp for its age. A circle encloses a cross whose arms widen at the ends, not the standard Latin form, but the cross, favored by the order. Around it, a ring of tiny notches. Counting them, you find they match exactly the number of years between the founding of the Templar order and the year of its suppression. The weight of it sinks in. This is no decorative flourish. It is a signature, a confirmation that every other sign you followed was placed for a reason. It does not tell you the entire message. Perhaps no single marker could, but it tells you this: you are standing exactly where someone, centuries ago, wanted you to stand. The keystone keeps its quiet vigil overhead, visible to all, understood by almost none. That is its genius, the last piece of the puzzle, hidden in a place so obvious that it disappears into the background, waiting for the day when the right eyes will see it. You draw a breath in the cool air of the nave. The pieces settle in. Your mind, not as scattered curiosities, but as parts of a single machine, Stone, light, number, direction, image, absence, repetition, each one is charming on its own, like a magician's coin, but together they move like gears. The machine starts here, with the keystone that counts the years from beginning to end. A quiet confession that someone here knew the order's bookends and wanted you to hold both dates at once. The count is not decoration, it is a password, an acknowledgement that you are in the right place, speaking the right language. From there, the path unfolds in memory. You retrace the steps, not with your feet, but with the mind of the initiated. The guardians at the portal teach you that the doorway itself is an alphabet, pairing human and beast-like consonant and vowel-like direction and intention. Inside, the hidden knights wait in the margins, their gaze leading you to the first waypoint, rarely the most beautiful carving, but the one linked to time, an unfinished capital facing a window that stirs only at a certain dawn. Light is the unlock, but light is not the text. It merely makes the text visible. In that fleeting brightness, you mark the rose and cross. You find its partner on the font. Somewhere between them, a number repeats 3, 7, or 8, telling you how many paces, how many motifs before you must turn. It is low-tech two-factor authentication, medieval edition, one factor in stone, the other in sun. If they do not agree, you do not proceed. The theory takes shape. The code is not a single cipher to be cracked once and carried away like loot. It is a choreography, a ritual that can be performed at multiple sites by those trained in the same habits. The floor plan becomes the stage. The labyrinth condenses the route into a practice exercise, a miniature rehearsal. The stained glass teaches you to reverse what seems wrong until it becomes right. The fonts and choir stalls carry a portable alphabet, small symbols you can memorize without arousing suspicion. The master builder's marks certify that the site belongs to the network. And when a symbol is absent, you learn to treat that absence not as failure, but as instruction. The building examines you as you examine it. And what, you wonder, was it built to convey? You weigh the possibilities. A treasure map would be the least interesting, and perhaps the least likely. Greed makes codes loud, and this code is unashamed of silence. A manual for refuge routes is more plausible, given how compass bearings and roadside marks seem to braid interior signs with the pilgrim roads outside. And then there is doctrine, the most maddening possibility. Did the order hide not object but an idea? One it could not publish in the climate that destroyed it. Here, the chalice refuses to rest as a simple symbol of the Eucharist. It shifts, it glimmers, it resists, as though it might be pointing to something deeper, something still waiting to be read. In the company of stars, roses, and stems that lean just enough to catch your notice without ever seeming misplaced, the image unfolds, not merely as an emblem, but as a destination in itself. It feels less like a simple ornament and more like an arrival point, a signpost disguised in beauty. The cup you see before you is not, in truth, a cup at all, at least not in the ordinary sense of the word. It is a place, a coordinate, a silent invitation, a test of recognition that tells you you have arrived at the house that knows the story. You keep your footing by holding on to what is beyond dispute, anchoring the theory in facts no one challenges. There is, after all, a bedrock of history, here a real, documented, indisputable. It is a matter of record that Pope Clement V dissolved the Order of the Temple with the papal bull Vox in excelso in 1312, and yes, at least on parchment, much of the Templars' vast wealth and properties were transferred to the Knights Hospitaller. But the truth of paper and the truth of stone rarely match perfectly. That transfer left gaps wide enough to lose a fleet in percent. Into those unaccounted spaces poured the quiet movements and secret practices of men who were not only skilled in building but in moving without noise. Men who understood that survival in such an age depended on subtlety as much as strength. It's not a wild leap to imagine these men methodical, disciplined, deeply trained, standardizing their memory work. And where better to hide it than in the only archive that would survive confiscations, fire, and war? They tucked their knowledge into stone. Stone cannot be rewritten by a scribe who might betray you. It cannot be casually burned. It does not crumble with age if it is well placed. If you were designing such a systema knowledge vault for an age of suspicion and seizure, you would choose a medium that wore the robes of piety while behaving like granite. No scroll is safer than a column that parishioners dust every Easter without suspecting its purpose. No ledger is more discreet than a choir stall whose carvings no bishop ever reads by lamplight, and no repository is more durable than the geometry of light falling on a wall the same way, century after century, long after the original builders are dust themselves. The Templars, famously organized, meticulous in both faith and logistics, would hardly have abandoned their instincts the moment their seals were broken. The hinge on which this entire theory turns is small and easily overlooked: the persistence of certain dates. Dates that mattered only to them. You've already seen the October light effects, those solemn alignments that pay grim homage to the Mass. Arrests of 1307. You've seen axial alignments that ignore traditional feast day sunrises in favor of anniversaries significant only to certain commanderies. Such precision is no devotional accident. It is the deliberate placing of fingerprints left where only someone trained in the same calendar would think to look. And the fact that some of these fingerprints have been chipped away, replastered, or replaced is not a refutation of the theory. On the contrary, it's evidence that the fight over meaning has been going on for centuries. A missing tile near the altar, an erased rose, a carefully reworked circle. These are not mere acts of routine repair. No one labors to erase a doodle. These are deliberate acts of censorship, which in turn tells us that what was once there mattered deeply to someone. So the question sharpens: was this code a stopgap measure, a survival kit intended to guide brothers through 2 or 3 generations of danger until a new equilibrium formed? Or was it something else, a time capsule with a built-in trigger condition? As if to say, when the sky and the numbers match again, when the roads are safe, when our signs can be read without burning the reader, then and only then, open the next door. If it was the former, you would expect all paths and symbols to converge on practical destinations: granaries, hidden libraries, caches of arms, perhaps 1 or 2 relics of immense value. But if it was the latter, then convergence is not about retrieval, but recognition. It is about confirming that the lineage has survived, not in the fragile flesh of individuals, but in the method itself. Logistics transformed into liturgy. secrets woven so deeply into the fabric of devotion that they become inseparable from it. The Templars' methods were not guesswork. These were men who built networks of commanderies, kept ships provisioned across continents, and balanced accounts with near military precision. They would never rely on fragile keys that could be lost or stolen. They would distribute redundancy across their network. They would design initiation rites that fail safely if an outsider tries to force them. And most importantly, they would ensure the system required travel. The reader of the code would need to visit multiple sites to piece together the message. In doing so, the network would remain alive. Roads would stay open. Relationships would be renewed. And the bonds of shared pilgrimage would protect the very knowledge being sought. Beauty, too, would be part of the design, not as a luxury, but as security. For beauty makes its shelter indispensable. No parish will sell the baptismal font that has welcomed their children for generations. If its rim quietly whispers coordinates at midnight. No town will demolish the arch whose keystone graces their postcards, even if its carved notches mark a calendar they were never meant to know. This is security by devotion, and depending on your point of view, it is either genius or mischief, whether you are the king signing the arrest warrant or the mason signing his work in stone. You allow yourself one small modern comparison. Because the building earns it, the whole system behaves like a distributed protocol. Verification is built into sunlight and geometry. The credentials are too humble to attract thieves, too ordinary to draw tax collectors. The recovery phrase, if we can call it, that is stored, amusingly enough, in choir stalls and miscopied records that only the choir itself would notice. There are no passwords to forget early dawns to remember, without fail, since the 13th century. And so you return, finally, to the keystone and its quiet ring of years. Whether it leads you to a hidden repository or inducts you into a brotherhood of readers may be the final riddle it keeps for those who will bear it onward. Is the method, and the answer you will forever chase is the motive. Both wait, patient as granite, warm as an October sunbeam. The building exhales as you turn toward the door, its cool breath trailing you into the fading afternoon. Across the stone, every mark you have traced, every shadow you have followed, every line of the building's silent grammar stays with you. Now you see that you have not been wandering through ruins at Albert, through a mind that thinks in stone and speaks in light, and has been speaking all along to anyone willing to listen in silence. You pause on the threshold, the place where the stone guardians keep their watch. The lion's spiral mane catches the sun one final time before shadow swallows it. And for a heartbeat, you feel that the entire day has been arranged for this moment. You remember the rose and the cross tucked near the base of the column. The way the labyrinth compressed an entire journey into the space of a single floor. The keystone's tally of years. None of these were random curiosities scattered by chance. The Templars are gone in the official census by decree 700 years ago, but in the ways that matter, they remain. Their knowledge, their methods, the way they embedded meaning into beauty is all still here. The code they left behind, whether meant to guard a location, a truth, or a way of seeing, has not been erased. It has been weathered, worn, sometimes broken, but never silenced. Its survival is not merely in the symbols themselves, but in the discipline that produced them, in the decision to build beauty that could bear the weight of meaning, and in the quiet faith that someday someone would come and know how to read it. You step fully outside now, the sunlight falling over your shoulders. The road ahead is empty, but you know you are still on the same path, the one pilgrims once walked, the one mapped in the labyrinth's turns and the compass Rose's bearings. The stones may be the windows reglazed. A code that survives this long is not asking for final answers. It is asking to be carried forward, to be read again in 100 seasons by eyes not yet born. You leave knowing the Templar legacy is not buried treasure or relics hidden in vaults. It is the survival of a language that makes stone speak, that makes shadow write, that lets light unlock truths meant to live forever in the space between the seen and the unseen.